Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste friends, we are continuing with the previous lecture where we began with post-colonial historiography, discussed issue of subjectivities and question of archive, and then we started talking about history of partition. In this discourse on trauma, on victimhood, gradually it became quite clear that partition cannot be merely seen as event, rather it has influenced and shaped Indian society for a very long period of time, and the trauma spilled over in the lives of families for a very long period. Thus, it is highly difficult, even though it started in 1947, in some cases slightly early, and we can trace communal classes as events, but in terms of suffering, in terms of experiences faced by those who witnessed, those who personally suffered, it is difficult to contain the narrative and demand of these narratives within the frame of history of events. We also briefly, towards the end of our previous lecture, we mentioned that how literature attracted historians, and they went into the accounts which were coming from the period, near contemporary period of partition. This literature sensitized historians' gaze to different possibilities of looking at the question of suffering. So, it was not merely to glean information or to substantiate and supplement already given account. But this also reminds that engagement between history and literature was not new. social historians had even in the past paid attention to literature. For literature has always been a very potent ground of identity politics, for the construction of identities in Indian context. For example, historians had earlier visited late 19th century scenario, milieu, to understand the constructs of history and to understand the communal identity politics at that point of time. So, engagement with history had a long trajectory. However, by mid 1980s, literature was also looked at as an alternative archive for social history, not merely of communal violence, but where different forms of inequality, different kinds of experiences were articulated. For example, the experience of migration from rural to urban landscapes, the question of stereotypes, and many such aspects were looked at from the vantage point of literary history and cultural history. These engagements further complicated the relation between fiction and discipline of history. The question of evidence remained crucial. Just as in the case of partition, the questions, as we talked in the beginning, questions were raised about authenticity, about truth claims of these narratives, and these questions, these hesitations were also quite masterfully handled. Thereby expanding our understanding of history and past. Similar question of evidence came up quite forcefully in another genre of history from another perspective, and this was women's history, which itself has many phases and many perspectives. This history of engagement with women's lives and their position globally goes back to the earlier decades of particularly 1960s, when in American context a slogan came into vogue. The slogan was, "What is personal is political." The claims were twofold. A, history has ignored women's presence in society, has in that sense done great injustice to half of human society by ignoring their role in social life. So, the question of recovery of women at different point of time occupied the concerns of this scholarship. In Indian context, we have many good accounts. Particularly noteworthy is the account which came much later though, but which offers us a synoptic understanding of women's participation and role in Indian freedom struggle, is by Geraldine Forbes, and this came in part of Cambridge History of India series. Here she has documented and analyzed women's participation in different political movements and changing status of women among various other aspects. For the paucity of time and for the sake of our focus, I am not going into detail account by account description of women's writings coming from modern Indian perspective, but I am trying to engage with core questions and shifting frame of this engagement here in this historiographical exercise. Soon after this phase of recovery of woman figure and their participation in the past, the question which was provocatively asked was how to engage with women's work which are often go unnoticed outside the formal regimes of work. For example, how to engage with women in the home and their work, their contribution. In this context, History of Doing by Radha Kumar is a wonderful example. The question of which was posed in the context of partition, or which are of an overarching question of subjectivities and experiences in the context of scholarship on women's history. The question was raised how to account for the silent sufferings, the exploitation which women face in any patriarchal structure. So, while engagement with patriarchy gave one perspective, this question of women's experience has been engaged also as a deep methodological question. And this question boils down to the formulation, particularly in context of history, and the question is, what is the evidence of experience? If the personal is political, and this is why woman's body is not even her own body, but has been a site of patriarchal gaze and claims, then the personal, the domain where she suffers, the domain where she is violated, who can verify her experience other than her own self? And in that context, whether that experience can be considered as valid evidence or not. These questions then took historians into the epistemic foundations of history itself, and a perspective which emerged was that of history, like any other discipline, was gendered itself. So, the question was not merely looking at one or another aspects of patriarchal power and its ramification, but how the very understanding of history, very formation of knowledge itself, which claims to be neutral, which claims to be objective, which claims to be universal, is in fact always a gendered construct. This question of authenticity and verifiability then also we find, and the contestation over the issue of verifiability and authenticity, which we just talked about in the context of women's history or gendered history. We also see a very interesting parallel of similar anxiety coming from the segments, the experiences and the history of scheduled caste groups from the subcontinent. Untouchability and exploitation of this segment of society has been ignored for very long time, just as women and their presence had been ignored quite systematically for a very long time in Indian historiography. Scholars, historians, looking at movements and contributions, movements associated with and contributions of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, have highlighted the question of caste and the politics of untouchability in modern Indian context. This scholarship got many insightful perspectives and supports from anthropological accounts, anthropological studies of different scheduled caste communities, in the context of discipline of history. Writings by Gail Ombet and Eleanor Gilliatt immediately come to our mind. But like partisan discourse and like feminist history, women's history, here also a very fruitful exchange we witness between literature and history. Biographical accounts are consulted to narrate this history, and in context of Maharashtra we have scholarship which are immensely insightful on this. An engagement with this discourse has also forced us to revise many of our generalizations. For example, for a very long time, Indian cities have been conceptualized as sites of oppression and exploitation. However, these narratives of coming from members of scheduled caste communities and Ambedkar's writings have forced us to alter this understanding, and instead of cities, now Indian villages come to us as sites of oppression, sites seething with caste inequalities. And a journey from village to cities is at one level comes up as full of its liberatory potentials. However, poets have also warned and cautioned, poets from scheduled caste community have also cautioned that this may be a too simplistic understanding, and soon after entering into urban landscape, the community people started facing different other kinds of exploitations. Nevertheless, the point worth mentioning here is that an engagement with Dalit studies, what has been often referred as Dalit studies, or narratives from scheduled caste communities, have forced us to revise many of our presumptions. In this regard, in recent decades, a very fruitful and insightful debate is taking place on how to engage with experiences which are extremely traumatic, but which do not come from any specific event or location, but this is an experience of being an untouchable. How to engage with this experience, which no other person can experience or share, as it is unique to the member of the community of untouchables. For example, how to write about history of humiliation, which are often articulated in vague and in so many varied ways that it is even difficult to catalog them. These debates, one particular debate I am referring here is between Gopal Guru and philosopher Sundar Sarukkai, and the conversation has come up in book form titled Cracked Mirror. These debates, though, do not form the domain of history, but discipline of history has been engaging with such debates and getting enriched in turn. Again, like the question of evidence of experience, which we noticed in the case of gender history, here again the point is what is or how to account for such experiences of humiliation, of untouchability, the pain of being framed in such manner and being treated as an untouchable. In history, here along with the question of identity and caste discrimination, the methodological question posed is also about the limitation of representation itself. Such kind of personalized experiences, can it be justifiably represented by people who may not be part of this community? Will that be a just representation? Will that be an adequate representation, or will it be a misrepresentation? These are ongoing debates, and point is not to offer any closure here, but to take insights, and this is what historians have been doing. Another crucial field which has attracted lot of attention in the last two decades is the field of visual history. Historians have pointed out that the basic training of researchers in the discipline has always been to read documents, to read written accounts in the archive to write history. In that sense, conventionally, history depends on written words. In that tradition, even oral accounts were for very long time either ignored or were treated as less authentic, and hence only much later oral history acquired certain respect in the domain of history. From mid 70s onwards, outside Indian context, scholars began to point towards this centrality of written words in the reconstruction of history and started suggesting different other registers for an engagement with history, to reconstruct history. And in that context, attention was drawn to visual material, pictorial registers, pictures, photographs, images of different kinds, cartoons, iconography. These started attracting historians' attention. However, this domain, which was earlier part of art history, soon began to attract historians who were interested in looking at social, cultural, and even political history. In the context of Indian history, anthropologists began engaging with history of photography, and one particular noteworthy book I would like to recommend is by Christopher Pinney. It is called Camera Indica. Christopher Pinney, who is trained as an anthropologist, has also come up with various other very insightful studies. Another book is called Photos of Gods. His initial field work was in a small town in Madhya Pradesh, but he quite insightfully, quite brilliantly goes back to history, to colonial period, to the history of this medium itself, and immense potentiality these photos, these images carry for historians. In case of India, Other efforts in this direction were towards lithographs, which because of its inexpensiveness had a wide circulation, and historians have looked at these registers to explore politics of gauge, the manner in which religiosity enters into the social domain, and how even the politics interacts with religiosities. In this context, it is important to bear in mind that the engagement has been primarily looking at pictorial registers, and thereby a very rich parallel archive, visual archive has been unearthed, and it is also waiting for many more path breaking works. On the other hand, when we are looking at visual history, we are reminded that in Indian context there are many ways of seeing. The term ways of seeing I am taking from a seminal work by John Berger. The point is that in Indian context there is a tradition, or rather I would say there is a practice of a particular form of seeing which is called darshan. The phenomena of darshan in Indian context refers to a particular exchange of gaze between devotee and the god or goddesses. A devotee goes to temple to have darshan of his or her gods or goddesses. Similarly, a god or a goddess may visit their devotee in dreams or in any other moment and give darshan. It is a very personalized experience. While visiting a temple to have darshan of God can be observed by any external observer, but the kind of darshan which a devotee may feel to have to be blessed by his or her Ishtadev or goddess is something which cannot be verified, yet it is a very powerful and very influential widespread practice. How can we factor this kind of unique experience coming from a specific segment of society, like the question of experience that we posed earlier in context of partition and in context of Dalit and women studies? Here again it is a deeply socially, culturally embedded phenomena. It is a, in that sense it is not even culturally embedded, it is a religious way of looking. What kind of insights this can provide to the question of history? Again, the scholarship is not strictly coming from history, but a very influential tract on Darshan is by Diana Ick. The point of concern for us is an engagement with the sacred experience. What tool does history offer to engage with this sacred experience? On the other hand, coming back to the question of pictorial, so the examples like Darshan complicate and forces us to move beyond the pictorial archive. On the other hand, engagement with, say, history of a photograph tells us a lot about the cultural practices within which a particular technology, photography, gets embedded in Indian subcontinent. Photograph, the camera, the daguerreotype camera, as soon as it came in 1839-40, within a very short time span it reached to India and even to small towns and princely states. Soon a medium which claimed to contain truth value, which claimed its indexical properties to capture the actual moment, and the potential of camera as a witness to capture reality had already replaced the status of painting as a tool to capture moment, a slice of history, and it is this claim of a photograph as an index of time, as the most authentic representation of the subject, gave rise to a very complicated regime of identity making. It got associated with passport, with the whole idea of proof in history, but historians of photography have also pointed out how camera as a witness was staged, and how rather than representing naive reality, it projected the aspired reality and aspired identity. Along with photograph, different other formats, registers like cartoons, images have been taken into account. Historians have looked at this archive of popular visual prints to explore the question of nation and nationalism. For example, Sumati Ramaswamy in her book Goddess and the Nation has argued that in these registers the nation was represented as a bodyscape of woman, Mother India, and in that history we come across coming together of cartographic imagination with visual imagination of nation as woman. It is also important here to mention that this is a recent and ongoing field of scholarship. A lot is yet to be achieved. Particularly, there is very less engagement on the pictorial and the written words, and how the two enter into dialogue with each other to represent history. Also, we have a very meager, almost no engagement of this visual archive in vernacular politics, in vernacular arenas. how in different regional settings these images functioned and gave shape to different and different social constructs. To summarize, these recent historiographical trajectories, we may say that while new questions are formulated, new sources are unearthed, new engagements with subjectivities hitherto ignored have been explored and analyzed, yet the field of historical scholarship is wide open with its challenges and with its rewards. Thank you.